All right, let's get right into chapter 1. And, sorry about that, which is really the definition of what anthropology is. I talked a little bit about this already in the introduction, but I want to get a little bit more into it. Now, anthropology comes from the Greek words anthropos, which means human, and logos, which means literally the word, or in this context, the study of. So the study of humans is anthropology. And as I mentioned in the introductory lecture, we need to take a holistic approach to this. But to think of humans holistically is too hard for one person to do. We know too much information about each aspect of what humans are for one person to know everything about it. So if you're interested in human biology, you can become a physical anthropologist. You can study human biology. But you probably don't have enough time to study the arts and literature of every human out there either. So you kind of have to make decisions. But at some point, when you want to draw a picture of what a group of people are or what humanity is like in general, you're going to have to bring those aspects together, those specializations together. And it's also important to remember that what anthropology is trying to do is a systematic and organized study of humanity, not just I simply know, I can intuit what humans are because I am a human. Because we bring biases and mistakes to our understanding. We also, even when we're not mistaken, we bring our own perspectives, which may not be universal. This is where anthropology tends to be not just holistic, but comparative. And so by analyzing one culture and one group of people, or one biology of people with another group of people, and comparing those, you can then say, okay, what are the reasons for the differences between them? And this is something that every single one of the sub-disciplines of anthropology, which are cultural anthropology, which is the focus here, but we'll be looking at all four fields. So cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and archaeology. And those four subfields each have comparative aspects to them, which help us to say, okay, this isn't the only way humans do things. We're not biased in thinking that's the only way, because here's another one that we can compare it to, and they do it differently. Or you can say, here's two that actually are doing things very similarly in a certain way, and so we can group them together into the same general pattern. So, an important place to start, I think, is with a misconception, and also a word that you'll only hear me say this one time if I can help it. The very famous philosopher, theorist, Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century wrote a very influential book called Leviathan, where he was looking at culture, society, politics, from a theoretical standpoint. And he started at what he thought was the basic level. And in his opening statements about humans and human nature, he very famously said, or wrote, I should say, that the natural state of man is war against every other man. Now, as I said, there's a word that I'm not going to use again if I can help it, and that is man. You heard me say anthropology is the study of humans. Anthropologists tend to reject the word man to describe our species these days because that has a bias in favoring a particular sex, and that's not really what we should be doing. We should be objective, and we should be using universal terms. I don't mean just men, I mean humans, which includes women, and it includes, as we're going to have a whole chapter on gender and sex in the second half of this course, so we'll learn a little bit more about that. So you won't hear me say man again. But Thomas Hobbes used that, and he was using that word to represent humans in general. But here's the thing. He was totally wrong. Humans, he saw at their basic level as in conflict with every other human. That it was competition. It was fight for survival. And while biologically speaking, natural selection, and we're going to learn a fair bit about this, natural selection is about competition and individual survival and reproduction. That's very true. That's the way the natural world works. That's the way biology works. But humans have never existed outside of culture. There is no wolfman that was raised by wild animals. There's no Mowgli. There's no Jungle Book. There's never been a human who has not been raised by other humans. We survive as a group. We survive together, and our culture is what keeps us alive. So there's no retreating into some natural feral state of humans. We've never been there. We've never had that. Even before we were technically humans, even before our genus was created, we had communities, we had sociality, and we're going to look at examples from the natural world where other animals actually have pretty complex social structures. We're not the only ones. So in order to understand ourselves, it's not just about understanding you individually and you're jockeying for position. You're jockeying for position within a group of other humans. So Thomas Hobbes was wrong in that sense. He was right about some other things, but understanding culture is important to understanding who we are. And one thing that's going to be probably very difficult for you in an introductory course is to define a couple of terms. And so I'm going to give you these terms immediately, even though I don't think this chapter deals with them just yet. We're going to come to these time and time again, and I'm going to refer to these two terms over and over, and I'd like you to pick up in your brain what this means. And these are the two words. They're two four-letter words. One of them is called emic, E-M-I-C, and etic, E-T-I-C. Now, emic is a perspective, and that is what we can define as the insider's view. That this is the way you just intuitively know the way that your culture works. You can walk into a McDonald's and you know that you're supposed to get in line, and you go up to the counter and you place your order. You probably already know some of the items on the menu, and you place them, and you know that you're supposed to wait. And there's an etiquette, there's a culture, there's a behavioral pattern that you're familiar with. Now I'm just bringing that up as one example. That's a pretty mundane one. You might go to church, and you probably know when to sit, stand, and kneel. You know what songs to sing. You can go into a art gallery, and you know that you're supposed to stand a certain distance and look at the artwork on the walls, and your perspective is one of an insider's understanding. You're the insider in the emic perspective. Now, ultimately, that's what an anthropologist is interested in, is the way that people live their lives as part of a culture, right? But that's not a very good way to describe your own culture, at least in terms of a universal understanding. That an anthropologist tries to avoid emic terminology and descriptions, because you may be working on autopilot. You may not understand the reasons why you do certain things. You may not have really thought about it before. That's just the way things are done in this culture. Why don't you go and put your face right up against an artwork in a museum, in an art gallery? Why don't you lick it or touch it and feel it? If you'd probably be kicked out of the museum or the art gallery if you were to do that. But you know not to do that, right? but you've probably never thought about it. You just know the etiquette, you know the behavior, you know the patterns. But an anthropologist who is trying to describe behaviors is trying to use universal, scientific, objective terms as an outsider. So the insider's view is the lived experience. That's the emic. And that's what anthropologists are interested in, is how humans behave in their own cultures. Whereas the anthropologist doesn't use the emic terminology to describe it. They use jargon, they use universal terms that can compare. So you can say that, all right, in this culture, the art galleries are places where the artists are full-time specialists that are removed from everyday society, and art is placed into particular areas of artistic focus. And you are not to approach or touch those things. That would be the etic description of the behavior that the emic person sees. But the reason why an etic terminology would be used is because that anthropologist may turn to another culture and say, actually, art is to be picked up and handled and used and maybe even destroyed. And that's the way another culture treats art, is that it is a more tactile, more integrated focus, rather than something that is only in certain places and venues. So you can see maybe that the utility of etic, it's trying to describe the emic lived experience, but by remaining objective and using universal terms that all anthropologists use, then you can describe all cultures and then compare them and say, okay, they treat art differently. So you'll need to learn some of the terminology. You'll need to learn those etic terms and be able to turn those onto cultures that you observe, and maybe even you can turn them on as a mirror onto your own life and maybe think about, why do I behave this way? Why is this the case? I never thought about it. I just did it. I just had this emic lived experience. Now, the reason why this is important is because it's very easy to think that the way you do things is the only way, or the best way, or the proper way. But actually, there's a range of ways that you can live your life. There's a range of values. And this brings up another subject, which is what's called cultural relativism. Now, you sometimes hear cultural relativism or relativism used as a pejorative term, where they just say, oh, you're just being relativistic. Now, in anthropology, cultural relativism does not mean that one culture is better than the other. It doesn't mean that one is relatively better and one was relatively worse. It means that you have to understand the behaviors in their own contexts. That in order to understand a particular behavior, you need to treat it in its own from its own emic perspective, the way that somebody would live that experience. Now you, as the etic observer, as the anthropologist describing it, may hate it. You may dislike what you observe. You may think that this is bad behavior, or you disagree with it and you want to change it. That's okay to think that, but you need to continue to describe it objectively and from the perspective of the lived experience. You need to try to understand the way that that emic lived experience happens. Because then later on you can say, okay, I now understand the richness of why this behavior exists in this culture. It maybe there's poverty, or maybe there is a particular way of organizing or social structure, or all sorts of things that could be factors that could then influence the way you understand this behavior in its own context. Once you understand it from a scientific or social scientific way, from an etic perspective, then you can take that information, be confident in its accuracy, and you can use that, or someone else can use that. You can offer it to policymakers or change makers, and you can apply that anthropology knowing that that is true information rather than just your opinion about something. So let's get into what anthropology is and how it's done, right? So anthropology studies human variation because we are all one race of creatures. We are all humans. We are all human beings, Homo sapiens, sapiens. But what does that mean? We want to understand with as much detail as we can possibly find what human beings are. So biologically, what are we? How are we different from other animals? How did we emerge? What's our evolutionary history? Where do we come from? Why do we have two eyes forward facing in our heads? Why do we grow beards during quarantine? Why do we have color vision? Why do we stay awake during the daytime and go to sleep at nighttime? Why do we walk on two legs? Why do we have eat the food that we eat? Why are we vulnerable to diseases? All of these things are things that biological or physical anthropology and archaeology can tell us about. That they gathered the data that helps us understand our physical nature. But what about behavior? Is that biological? You may think no. But what about a school of fish or a flock of birds or a herd of animals? Are they choosing to herd or to school or to flock? No, they have these instincts that are passed on from generation to generation that are behavioral, but they're also part of evolutionary biological processes. We also have behavioral aspects to ourselves that can only really be interpreted as genetic or as inherited. So I don't have to worry about breathing, for instance, right? I have a physical body, but that body needs to breathe. I need oxygen to survive, and I would never go to sleep, or I would certainly not want to go to sleep if I had to think about breathing every time I took a breath. I wouldn't want to go to sleep at all. But my body has a behavior which is to draw breath every few seconds and to keep that going. I also feel hunger and thirst. Now, I don't choose to have those impulses, but those I inherited those biologically to feel hunger and thirst and pain. And those are in my body's indications of things that I should do. They're guiding me towards certain behaviors and practices. And so while I can endure pain, I would choose not to feel it. And so I may alter my behaviors based on my biology. And that's actually more successful to have those biological urges than to not. The same thing goes for, you may think of food and water and air as all essential things, but what about sex? Sexual impulses are things that people typically feel. Is that a biological need? Well, if you want to see the next generation of humans and perpetuate these genes into the future, yes. Absolutely, that is a need. Feeling sexual urges ensures that you're going to have babies, which means that you're going to have the next generation. And so the survival of those genes are going to be enhanced by those creatures, those humans that have sexual urges that then produce babies and offspring. So then you'll see those behaviors happen going into the future. So all of these are universals. These are universal characteristics that humans have. But let's take thirst for a moment, right? We all drink water. We all have to drink in order to survive. But do you think that the habits of someone who feels thirsty in a rainforest is going to be different from the habits of somebody who feels thirsty in an arid environment, in a desert? Of course they are, because there are specific differences in terms of environment that means that humans have to adapt differently in different places. And so you have cultures emerging that are adaptations and create responses to universal needs in different ways. So you're going to have shelters, houses, and things that are going to look different from one culture to the next because there's different materials, there's different requirements. A mountain village is going to look different to a coastal village. A city is going to look different from a camp. You also have to communicate culture. You have to be able to organize and operate within a group. We'll come to some of these lessons more specifically later on, which means that you're going to have different languages, different symbols, different writing, different communication, different artwork, different literature, different songs. All of these things are going to be localized and very specific, particular to each of these groups. So you'll have genetic adaptations, you'll have technological adaptations, you'll have long-term physiological or developmental adaptations, and short-term physiological adaptations. And you can see this changing through time from when before humans existed, our ancestors who were Australopithecines and even earlier, right down into the Homo genus, which is us, and our species Homo sapiens. And archaeology and paleoanthropology looks at the fossil record from our past to see how we developed into both the physiology that we have today and the cultures that we have today. So let's look at these 4 fields of anthropology a little bit more specifically. And we'll actually have whole chapters on these in the future, but I just want to touch on them right now. Cultural anthropology is really what our main focus is going to be in this course. And cultural anthropology, it combines a couple of different perspectives. Now, I talked about emic versus etic. Now, the subject matter of anthropology is the lived experience, the emic, right? The emic experience. But we have to use universal scientific terminology, which is the anthropological etic. And the description that an anthropologist creates about a specific culture, gathering data from observation and surveys and recordings and artifacts and all sorts of things, any data that you gather on a group of people and you write a report on that using etic terminology, this is what's called an ethnography. Ethnography. Ethne in Greek means people, and graphy means writing about. And so a report on a group of people is an ethnography. That's really good. That's a good starting point in anthropology. But as I mentioned before, we need to be able to take, you could do an ethnography about yourself, for instance. And in fact, for your term paper, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I'm going to ask you to write an ethnography, but I'll give you more of a description on this. But for anthropology to really look at the